There is a knock that follows death. It arrives exactly 1 minute after someone nearby stops breathing. Not sooner, not later, always 1 minute. At first, they told themselves it was coincidence. Then the knocking came closer, road to road, house to house, until it reached a snowed-in cabin with no escape and no more room for denial. Because whatever is knocking doesn't want to come in. It wants to be answered. And once you do, it starts counting you down.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. This story starts with a death nobody heard. The mountain had a way of swallowing sound. Snow softened everything. Footsteps, wind, even thought. It clung to the pines and buried the road in pale drifts that erased direction. Up here, distance wasn't measured in miles, but in how long it would take before someone noticed you were gone. By the time anyone realized that Evan Calder was dead, the mountain had already decided to keep him. His truck sat crooked along the logging road, half buried, one tire spinning uselessly in the air. The engine had gone cold hours earlier. His phone lay somewhere beneath the snow inside the cab, battery drained from searching for signal that never came. When the search party finally reached him 2 days later, his body was stiff, his face calm in a way that unsettled everyone who saw it. No signs of struggle, no wounds, just a man who had stopped breathing in a place where no one could hear it happen. The official report would later blame exposure. Hypothermia was convenient like that. It explained everything and nothing at the same time. But the mountain had already marked the moment of his death. Exactly 1 minute after Evan Calder's heart stopped, someone else heard a knock. Mara Hensley was standing in her kitchen when it happened, rinsing a mug she hadn't finished drinking. The cabin windows were fogged with cold, the kind that seeped through old wood and settled into the bones. Outside, the forest pressed close, dark trunks, white ground, no movement. Then came the sound, a single hollow knock. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to demand acknowledgment. Mara froze, her hand still submerged in icy water. She waited for a second knock, the way people always did when they forgot something or realized they'd knocked too softly. It didn't come. She frowned, glanced at the clock above the stove. The red digits glowed steadily. 7:41 p.m. No headlights outside, no footprints in the snow, no reason for anyone to be there. She crossed the cabin slowly, each step careful, listening. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, but nothing answered back. When she reached the door, she rested her palm against the wood. Cold, solid, silent. She didn't open it. After a long moment, she told herself it had been the wind. The mountain made noises all the time, wood contracting, ice shifting, branches brushing where they shouldn't. Still, she locked the door, then checked it twice. Later that night, hours after the knock had faded into memory, Mara's phone buzzed with a missed call notification that wouldn't load. No signal, no voicemail, just a name she recognized from town. Evan Calder. She didn't know yet that he was already dead when her phone tried to ring. She didn't know that the knock had arrived 1 minute after his death, precise as a heartbeat stopping. And she didn't know that she was no longer uninvolved. The next morning, the storm rolled in without warning. Snow fell heavy and fast, erasing the road, sealing cabins into white silence. Radios crackled with partial updates, warnings, closures, delays. The search for Evan Calder began late and moved slowly, hampered by terrain and weather and the quiet cruelty of the mountain. By the time his body was found, word traveled the way it always did up here, through glances, half-finished sentences, and lowered voices at the general store. That's when the second knock happened. This time, it was heard by a man named Tom Weaver, 3 miles down the road while he was sitting alone in his workshop, sharpening tools. One knock, same tone, same restraint. Tom checked his watch out of habit, 9:12 a.m. He would later remember the exact time with uncomfortable clarity. When news reached him an hour later that Evan Calder had been found dead, Tom did the math without realizing why. His stomach tightened, not from grief, but from something colder and sharper. 2 knocks, 2 witnesses, 1 death. They didn't compare notes yet, not openly. Mountain towns were careful with questions that didn't have answers. People here believed in patterns the way others believed in prayer, quietly, privately, and with a certain amount of fear. But the phrase began to form, passed in whispers and unfinished thoughts. The knock never arrives alone. That night, as snow piled higher and the world shrank to the size of a room lit by weak yellow bulbs, Mara lay awake listening to the cabin breathe around her. The walls creaked, the wind pressed close, searching for gaps. She told herself she was safe. She told herself it was over. Then she heard it again. Not at the door. From somewhere deeper inside the cabin. A soft, deliberate knock. And this time, it sounded like it already knew where she was.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The knock came exactly 1 minute later. Morning came slowly, as if the mountain were reluctant to admit it was still alive. Snow had buried the world overnight. Pines bowed under the weight, their branches creaking like old bones. The road between cabins had vanished entirely, replaced with a smooth, unbroken white that made distance feel theoretical. Sound didn't travel well in weather like this. It dissolved, which made what happened next impossible to ignore. Mara stood at her kitchen table with a notebook she hadn't owned yesterday. She didn't remember deciding to write things down, only the feeling that if she didn't, something important would slip away, something already trying to hide. She wrote the time of the knock, 7:41 p.m. She underlined it twice. Across the mountain, Tom Weaver was doing the same thing, though he used the back of an old receipt and a carpenter's pencil worn flat from years of use. He wrote 9:12 a.m., then stared at the numbers until they stopped feeling like coincidence. By noon, the power flickered and died. By early afternoon, the radio crackled to life with fragments of conversation that weren't meant for everyone. Names, locations, delays, and finally, confirmation, Evan Calder's estimated time of death. Mara heard it first. Her radio sat on the counter, volume low, antenna bent at an angle that only worked if you didn't touch it. The voice on the other end sounded tired, practiced. Likely passed at approximately 7:40 p.m. last night. Exposure... Mara didn't hear the rest. Her eyes dropped to the notebook. 7:41 p.m. 1 minute. Her heart slowed, then sped up as if it were trying to catch itself making a mistake. She told herself it was a rounding error. Medical estimates weren't exact. Radios distorted things. Memory was unreliable, especially after the night like the one she'd had.
Still, she didn't close the notebook. They would have kept their thoughts to themselves if the mountain hadn't forced them together. By evening, the storm intensified. Snow fell sideways, dense and relentless. When Tom's generator failed, he packed what he could and started the slow trek toward Mara's cabin, the nearest place with a wood stove and walls thick enough to keep the cold out. He arrived just before dark, breath ragged, beard crusted with ice. Mara let him in without asking why he'd come. The mountain had already made the decision for both of them. They sat across from each other at the table, steam rising from chipped mugs. For a long time, neither spoke. The cabin ticked and sighed as it adjusted to the temperature change. Then Tom said, "What time did you hear it?" Mara didn't ask what he meant. 7:41, she replied. Tom closed his eyes. "I heard mine at 9:12 this morning. One knock. That was it." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Evan," Mara said quietly. Tom nodded. They just confirmed it on the radio. Neither of them said the obvious thing. They didn't need to. The math had already been done. 1 minute after death. Not sooner, not later. Precise. Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "That can't be random." Tom shook his head slowly. "Nothing that clean ever is." They compared notes as the night deepened. Another knock, heard years ago by an old woman who lived alone near the ridge, 1 minute after her husband died in his sleep. A story dismissed at the time as grief. Another, more recent, after a logging accident 2 towns over. Always faint, always singular, always closer. Mara traced an invisible line on the table with her finger, connecting places on an imagined map. "It's moving inward," she said, "toward people." Tom swallowed. "Toward us." That's when they said it out loud for the first time. "Every death triggers a knock, and each one comes closer than the last," Tom finished. The cabin creaked, as if acknowledging the rule. Mara wrote it down, her hand trembling slightly. 1 minute is all it needs. She underlined that, too. Later, when the fire burned low and exhaustion softened the edges of fear, they allowed themselves a moment of relief. Patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant control. "If we know when it happens," Tom said, forcing a thin smile, "maybe we can stay ahead of it." Mara nodded, though something in her expression remained tight. "As long as nobody dies nearby." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Snow pressed against the windows, erasing the world beyond the glass. The cabin felt smaller than it had before, its walls closer, its corners darker. They didn't hear the knock that night. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a held breath. Because somewhere out there, something was waiting, and it had already learned the rule.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. They tried to explain it away. By morning, the mountain looked harmless again. Sunlight reflected off the snow in a way that made the world seem clean, untouched. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. The storm had loosened its grip just enough to suggest mercy. If you squinted, you could pretend nothing had changed. Mara leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the cabin settle. The wood stove crackled softly. The air smelled of ash and old pine. Normal smells, normal sounds. Normal things didn't knock 1 minute after people died. But she didn't say that out loud. Tom stood by the window, peering through a narrow gap in the frost. "Wind's picking up again," he said. "That's probably all it ever was." Mara nodded too quickly. "Old cabins make noise. They always have." They traded explanations the way people passed hand warmers, carefully, gratefully, desperate for comfort. stress, shared trauma, suggestion. Tom said, if you talk about something long enough, you start to hear it everywhere. Mara forced a small smile, like when you buy a red truck and suddenly notice them all over town. The lie felt thin, but they let it stand, because denial was easier than naming what they were afraid of. If you name it, it feels smaller. Mara had heard that once, years ago, from a woman who believed words gave power to fear. At the time, it had sounded wise. Now it sounded like a warning she'd misunderstood. They spent the day busy on purpose. Tom shoveled snow away from the door, his movements sharp and rhythmic. Mara reorganized shelves that didn't need reorganizing, touching each item as if to reassure herself it was real. The radio remained silent except for static. Cell phones stayed useless. Hours passed, though outside the light barely changed. The cabin existed in its own pocket of time, insulated by snow and unspoken dread. Every creak made them glance up. Every pause in sound stretched too long. By late afternoon, they almost believed themselves. Almost. That was when the knocking came again. It was louder this time, not forceful, but deliberate. 3 solid taps against the front door. Mara dropped the mug she was holding. It shattered against the floor, coffee bleeding into the cracks between the boards, like something trying to escape. Tom didn't move. They stood frozen, listening. The sound hadn't been hollow. It hadn't echoed. It had weight. That wasn't wind. Tom cleared his throat. "Tree branch," he said. "Snow sliding." Mara nodded, though her pulse hammered in her ears. Has to be. Neither of them went to the door. When no second knock followed, relief crept in, unwelcome but persistent. The human mind hated unfinished patterns. It rushed to close them. Tom laughed softly, a sound that felt practiced. "See? Nothing." Mara bent to clean up the broken mug, her hands shaking. "Told you, old wood." They didn't mention the fact that the knock had come from chest height. As evening settled in, the mountain pressed closer again. Shadows stretched long across the cabin walls. The fire dimmed. Outside, the wind began to howl, filling the spaces between trees with restless sound. They ate dinner quietly. That was when the knocking started to change. Not at the door, from the wall beside the staircase. One knock, then another. Slow, patient. Mara's breath caught. That's pipes, expansion. Tom stared at the wall, his face pale. Yeah, temperature shift. The knock came again. Closer together now, more intentional. Tom raised his voice as if volume could drown it out. "Cabins do this, you know that." Mara backed away, her spine brushing the opposite wall. "It's inside." The knocking moved. Up the stairs. Each tap echoed faintly through the narrow hallway, wood answering wood. Not random, not settling, ascending. Tom shook his head hard. No, that's... Another knock. This one came from above them. The ceiling creaked. Mara whispered the phrase like a prayer, like a shield. If you name it, it feels smaller. The knocking stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left behind, heavy and expectant. The cabin seemed to lean inward, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Tom let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob. "See? It stops when you don't react." Mara didn't answer, because deep down, she understood something neither of them wanted to say.
The knocking hadn't stopped because they ignored it. It had stopped because it had finished moving. And somewhere inside the cabin, something had found exactly where it wanted to be.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The snowstorm sealed them inside. The storm returned without warning. One moment, the mountain breathed quietly under moonlight. The next, the wind rose like something waking up angry. Snow slammed against the cabin walls in dense, blinding sheets, erasing distance, direction, and the last fragile illusion of control. Mara woke to the sound of the generator choking. It sputtered once, twice, then died. The lights went out with it, plunging the cabin into darkness so complete it felt solid, the kind of dark that pressed against the eyes, the kind that reminded you how small a room really was. Tom swore softly from the other side of the cabin. They moved carefully, guided by memory and the faint orange glow of embers still alive in the stove. The air felt heavier now, thick with cold, and the metallic scent of snow forced through old seams in the walls. Tom checked the radio first. Static, nothing else. Cell phones followed, dead zones where signal icons should have been. "The road's gone," Tom said, after peering through the window, though it was impossible to see more than a foot beyond the glass. Mara nodded. She already knew. The mountain didn't like to be challenged. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. They rationed light, one lantern between them. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, bending at angles that didn't match the fire's movement. The cabin seemed to shrink as the storm grew louder, wind forcing its way through every crack, every weakness. It felt sealed, not protected, trapped. Mara wrapped herself in a blanket and sat near the stove, listening. The storm had a rhythm to it now, long gusts followed by sudden violent impacts against the cabin's exterior. Something struck the door hard enough to make it rattle. Tom jumped to his feet. "Tree," he said immediately. Too fast. "Branch." Mara didn't answer. They stood there, staring at the door. Nothing followed. Relief came slowly, reluctantly. Tom exhaled and sat back down, rubbing his hands together. "See? Storm's throwing everything around." Mara swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. Yeah. She almost believed him. Almost. The knock came an hour later. 3 deliberate taps, not lost in the wind, not swallowed by snow. Clear, measured, close. Mara's heart slammed against her ribs as she stared at the door. The sound had come from the center of it, not the edge, not the frame. Chest height. Tom didn't speak this time. They listened as the storm continued to rage outside, wind howling loud enough to drown out most sounds, but not this one. The knock existed apart from the storm, untouched by it. Mara whispered, "Nothing comes in during a storm." Tom finished the sentence without looking at her. "Unless it's already close." The word settled heavily between them. Another knock followed. Softer now, patient, as if whatever waited outside understood that time was on its side. Tom reached for the shotgun propped near the wall. The sound of metal sliding against wood felt too loud. He cradled it awkwardly, uncertainty written across his face. "Who's there?" he called out, voice shaking despite his effort to steady it. Silence. Then, one knock. Mara shook her head violently. "Don't." Tom lowered the gun slightly. "If it's someone stuck out there." "No," she said.
Nobody survives this weather on foot, not long enough to knock like that. Another pause. The storm screamed. Then the knock came again, closer somehow, as if distance no longer mattered. Mara backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. Her breath came shallow, fast. "It doesn't want in," she said. "It wants us to answer." Tom stared at the door, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "You don't know that." Mara's voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes, I do." The knocking stopped. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Tom laughed weakly. "See, we're fine. It was just—" The knock came again. From inside the door. Not on it. Within it. The sound traveled through the wood, not against it. A hollow tap that vibrated through the handle, through the lock, through the bones of the cabin itself. Mara slid down the wall, her knees giving out. The lantern flickered. Tom stepped back, horror dawning slowly across his face as understanding replaced denial. "It didn't come in," he whispered. The knock came once more. Behind them, somewhere deeper in the cabin. The storm raged on, uncaring. And inside the sealed cabin, something that did not need roads or doors had finally arrived.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Someone answered when they shouldn't have. Fear has a shelf life. It burns hot at first, sharp, paralyzing, but eventually it dulls, softens at the edges. The body cannot stay braced forever. Muscles ache, thoughts wander, survival instincts start bargaining. Hours passed, though outside, the night stayed the same. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Wind battered the cabin in uneven waves, rattling shutters, forcing snow through seams that hadn't mattered in years. The lantern sat between Mara and Tom on the floor, its flame low and unsteady. Shadows clung to the corners of the room like stains that wouldn't scrub out. They had pushed furniture against the staircase. It was a symbolic gesture. They both knew it. Nothing knocked anymore. That was the problem. Silence stretched too long, pressing on their ears until every breath sounded intrusive. Mara hugged her knees, staring at the dark hallway beyond the barricade. Tom broke the quiet first. "What if it's done?" he said. Mara didn't look at him. "It doesn't stop. It just waits." Tom rubbed his face, exhaustion dragging at his features. "Or maybe it wanted attention, and we didn't give it any." Mara finally turned. "You heard it move. You know that." "I know what I think I heard," Tom snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm sorry. People lose their minds in storms. There are studies about it." "Studies don't knock," Mara said. Tom stood, restless. He paced the length of the cabin, boots scraping softly against the floor. "We can't sit here forever. If it's something real, someone trapped, hurt." Mara's voice was quiet but firm. "You don't survive out there long enough to knock like that." Tom stopped near the front door. The wood was thick, scarred, older than both of them. He stared at it, jaw tight. What if it's inside because we never answered? Mara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Don't say that." The cabin creaked. A sound followed. A single knock. Not loud, not close. Somewhere within the walls. Mara's breath caught. "Tom." "Hello?" he called out. The word slipped free before either of them could stop it. The knock came back immediately. One tap, perfectly timed. Mara scrambled to her feet. "You weren't supposed to—" Another knock,
then another. The rhythm changed, no longer patient, no longer singular, responsive. Tom's face drained of color. "I didn't open the door." Mara shook her head, eyes wide. "That wasn't the rule." The knocking came again, closer now, echoing through the hallway like sound traveling through bone. Then it spoke, not with a voice, with a knock that mimicked the cadence of Tom's greeting. Tap, tap, a pause, tap. Tom staggered back as if struck. "No!" Mara whispered the words as understanding settled in her chest, heavy and final. "It learned your voice." The lantern flickered violently. The knocking moved from the hallway to the wall behind them, then the ceiling. Each response matched Tom's breathing, his rhythm, his hesitation. Tom covered his mouth, but it didn't matter. The sound had already been taken. "It's just noise," he said hoarsely. "It's copying." The knock answered, sharper, closer, mocking. Mara grabbed his arm. "Don't talk to it again. Don't even think about it." Tom's eyes darted wildly, tracking the sound as it circled them. "I didn't mean to answer. People knock. You answer." The knocking stopped. For half a second, relief surged. Then came a final sound. From the door. 3 knocks. Exactly the way Tom had knocked on Mara's cabin days earlier when he'd needed shelter from the cold. Mara felt something break inside her. Tom stared at the door as if seeing himself reflected there. That's me." The handle rattled gently, not turning, testing. Mara pulled Tom back, dragging him away from the door. "It doesn't need to come in. It already has what it wanted." The knocking ceased. Silence poured back into the cabin, thicker than before. Tom collapsed on a chair, shaking. "I just said hello." Mara crouched in front of him, gripping his hands hard enough to hurt. "That's all it takes." The storm howled outside, uncaring. Inside the cabin, something listened, and now it knew exactly how Tom sounded when he was afraid.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. The knock started coming from inside. By morning, the cabin no longer felt like shelter. It felt occupied. The storm outside had softened into a steady, relentless snowfall, but inside, the air was stale and unmoving. Smoke from the stove clung too long before drifting upward. The walls seemed closer than they had been the night before, their shadows deeper, thicker, as if the darkness had weight now. Mara woke first. She lay still on the couch, eyes open, listening. No wind, no creaking beams, no knocking. That silence again, the kind that felt intentional. Across the room, Tom slept in the chair where exhaustion had finally dragged him under. His face was drawn, mouth slightly open, breath uneven. He looked older in sleep, smaller. Mara almost envied him. She sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. Her feet touched the floor. Tap. She froze. The sound hadn't come from the door. It hadn't come from the walls. It had come from directly beneath her feet. One sharp knock from inside the floorboards. Mara lifted her foot as if the wood had burned her. Tom stirred. "What?" Tap, tap. 2 knocks this time, closer together. Tom bolted upright, fully awake now. No. The sound traveled. From the floor to the wall beside the fireplace, then up toward the ceiling. It moved with purpose. Mara backed away, her pulse roaring in her ears.
It's not outside anymore. Tom shook his head violently. It can't be inside. That doesn't make sense. The knock answered him from behind the wall where the staircase rose. Slow, deliberate. Mara whispered the truth they'd been avoiding. Once acknowledged, it doesn't need doors. The phrase settled over them like ash. They tried to map it. Fear demanded logic, some pattern they could follow, some rule they could cling to. Tom grabbed the notebook Mara had been using and began scribbling wildly, times, locations, arrows connecting rooms. The knock started after deaths, he said, pacing. That was the rule. Mara watched the wall as if it might pulse. That was before you answered. The knock came again. From the ceiling this time, directly above Tom's head. He flinched, dropping the notebook. Pages fluttered open, revealing timestamps that now felt meaningless. What if someone died nearby? He asked desperately. What if there was another accident? Another... The knock interrupted him. Harder, sharper, closer than it should have been. Mara swallowed. It's not waiting for deaths anymore. The realization sank in slowly, like cold water filling the lungs. The countdown had changed. They moved through the cabin together, never separating, backs nearly touching as they checked each room. Every step felt like a violation, as if the space no longer belonged to them. The bedroom was quiet. Too quiet. The hallway ended abruptly at the cracked door, and beyond it, tap. The sound came from inside the bedroom wall. Mara screamed beside herself. The knock answered from the opposite wall, then the floor, then the ceiling, surrounding them. Tom covered his ears. Stop listening, he gasped. Maybe it needs that. Mara forced herself to breathe slowly, shallowly. It doesn't need sound. It needs acknowledgment. Another knock. Then another. The rhythm had changed again. Faster now, impatient. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a sick, sinking understanding. It's counting again. Tom looked at her, eyes wide. What counting? Mara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The knocking moved in a slow circle around the room, each tap landing closer than the last, as if measuring distance, not space. Time. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. We didn't hear about anyone dying. Mara's mouth tasted like copper. Maybe it's not distant anymore. The knock came again. From inside the wall, directly behind Tom. He staggered forward, clutching his chest. Mara, I don't feel right. She grabbed him as his knees buckled, pulling him down onto the bed. His skin was clammy, his breath shallow and uneven. Mara, he whispered, it's tight, like something squeezing. The knock echoed again. 1 minute never felt so long. Mara stared at the clock on the bedside table, its second hand ticking too loudly, each movement a hammer blow. This isn't how it was supposed to work, Tom rasped. Mara squeezed his hand, terror trying to pull her apart. It learned faster than we did. The knocking stopped. For half a heartbeat, hope flared. Then came a final knock from inside Tom's chest. Not audible, but felt. Tom gasped once, eyes wide with shock, and then his body went still. Mara screamed his name. The clock ticked on. 1 minute passed. Then, knock. From the door. Clear, measured, close. Mara backed away, shaking, tears streaming down her face. The rule was complete now. The knock no longer followed death. It created it. And it was already moving closer.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Every survivor heard a different name. Mara did not remember sitting on the floor. One moment she was standing at the foot of the bed, staring at Tom's unmoving body. The next, she was pressed against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, breath scraping in and out of her lungs like it had forgotten how to work. The cabin smelled wrong now. Not rot, not blood. Something flatter, emptier, like air that had been breathed too many times and forgotten how to refresh itself. Tom's eyes were still open. She closed them with shaking fingers, whispering an apology she wasn't sure was for him or herself. The knock did not come again. Not right away. That was how it learned. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. Mara drifted in and out of shallow sleep, trapped in that thin place where thought and memory tangled together. Every sound woke her, every shadow felt intentional. The cabin was no longer hostile, it was attentive. She stood eventually, legs numb, and wrapped Tom in a blanket. The act felt ceremonial, useless but necessary. People needed rituals when logic failed. She checked the radio again. Static. The clock still worked. Its ticking had grown louder, or maybe she just lost the ability to ignore it. She whispered into the empty room. "I didn't answer." Her voice sounded too small. The cabin answered anyway. A soft knock. From the wall behind her. Mara turned slowly. This one was different, closer to a tap than a knock, almost gentle. Then came the whisper. Mara. Her name, not spoken aloud, heard. Inside her head, threaded through memory and familiarity. The voice wasn't Tom's, it wasn't anyone she could place exactly, but it carried the weight of recognition. Her mother's voice had sounded like that before the cancer hollowed it out, warm, certain, unquestioning. Mara clutched her arms, nails digging into fabric. "No!" The whisper came again. "Mara, it's cold." Tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. She shook her head violently. "You're not her!" The knock answered. From the ceiling, from the floor, from inside the walls, always paired with the whisper. Her name, again and again. It wasn't calling her to the door. It was calling her inward. By morning, Mara understood something crucial. The sound wasn't consistent. The knock remained the same, measured, patient, but the whisper shifted depending on where she stood, what she thought about, what memory surfaced uninvited. When she lingered near the kitchen, she heard her father's voice, long dead, asking if she'd locked the door like he taught her. When she sat near the stairs, she heard a childhood friend's laugh, the one who'd fallen through ice years ago, echoing with the sound of frozen water cracking. Each whisper landed perfectly, never wrong, never random. It knows who you miss. The phrase formed in her mind fully intact, as if it had been waiting. Mara pressed her palms over her ears, but the whisper didn't travel through sound. It came through association, through absence, through the hollow places people didn't want to look at too closely. The knock followed each name, not before, not after, together, a pairing, an offering. She laughed once, sharp and broken, the sound startling even her. "You don't have a body," she said to the empty room. "You don't need one." The whisper shifted. "Neither do memories." The knock came harder that time, rattling the wall just enough to remind her the cabin still existed. By afternoon, exhaustion blurred the edges of fear. Mara began to talk, not to the thing, but to the space, to the cabin, to the absence where Tom had been. "It didn't change shape, it changed tactics," she said hoarsely.
The knock responded from the floor. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a theory. "You're not getting closer physically." The whisper came from behind her. "You are already close." Mara closed her eyes. That was the truth. The entity didn't move through space. It moved through attachment. It didn't need doors. It needed openings. Grief, guilt, love left unfinished. The knock came again, softer now, encouraging. Mara backed away until she hit the wall, breath shaking. "You won't get me that way." The whisper answered gently, patiently. "We already met." Her heart stuttered. She remembered the first knock, the kitchen, the mug, the cold water on her hand. She remembered the missed call from Evan Calder. She had known him, not well, but enough. Enough to feel something when she saw his name. Enough to hesitate. The knock came once more, from directly in front of her. Not loud, not threatening, inviting. Mara slid down the wall, tears soaking into the collar of her jacket. "You know my name. That doesn't mean you know me." The whisper paused. For the first time, it sounded uncertain. That hesitation, brief as it was, felt like a victory. But victories were dangerous things, because the knock didn't stop. It just waited. And somewhere in the cabin, something was already searching for the next name that would hurt more than the last.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. The countdown accelerated. Time did not behave correctly anymore. Mara noticed it first in the quiet moments when she tried to count her breaths and lost track somewhere between inhale and exhale. The clock still ticked, but its rhythm felt wrong. Too fast when she watched it, too slow when she didn't. The cabin existed in a bend, a pocket where minutes folded in on themselves, and whatever shared the space with her knew how to use that. The first shortened countdown came without ceremony. Mara had just finished dragging Tom's wrapped body into the back room, her muscles trembling, her thoughts distant and thin. She stood there afterward, forehead pressed to the wall, eyes closed. A soft knock came from the floor. She flinched, heart racing, instinctively glancing at the clock. 10 seconds passed. Then another knock. Closer. Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. "It's supposed to be a minute." The knock answered almost immediately. 3 seconds. The air felt tight, as if the room was shrinking around her ribs. "Time bends when it's almost finished." The phrase surfaced unbidden, settling into her thoughts with awful certainty. She backed into the hallway, shoes slipping on the wood. The knock followed, walls, ceiling, floor, no longer traveling so much as appearing wherever her fear pointed it. Mara pressed her hands against her ears, rocking. "You can't rush it," she said aloud, as if rules still mattered. "That's how it works." The whisper came, gentle and amused. "Rules change when there's no one left to watch the clock." The second death was smaller, quieter. It took Mara longer to recognize it as death at all. She was in the kitchen when the pain hit her chest, sharp, sudden, stealing her breath. For one panicked moment, she thought it was her turn, that the knock had simply skipped ahead. Then she saw the mouse. It lay near the pantry door, perfectly still, eyes glassy, body twisted as if it had simply stopped being alive mid-motion. The knock came almost immediately. Not 1 minute later, not even 10 seconds. Instantly. Mara stared at the tiny corpse, horror dawning slowly. "That counts?" she whispered. The knock answered from beneath the counter. "Yes." She backed away, bile rising in her throat. "You're cheating."
The whisper slipped through her thoughts like cold water. Everything dies. Another knock. Closer. Faster. Mara ran. She moved through the cabin blindly, heart pounding, each footstep chased by sound. The knocking no longer waited. It kept pace with her, overlapping itself, taps landing so close together they blurred into a rattling rhythm. The walls seemed to pulse with it. She burst into the bedroom and slammed the door, though she knew how useless that was. She pressed her back against it, gasping, tears streaking her face. "Stop," she begged. "Please." For a moment, just a moment, it did. Silence fell so abruptly it left her dizzy. Her heart slowed. Hope flickered. Then the knock returned, from inside her chest. Not felt like Tom's had been. Heard. A hollow tapping that matched her heartbeat exactly. She screamed. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. Mara curled on the bed, shaking, her body aching with exhaustion and terror. She had stopped checking the clock. It only made things worse. The knocks came in waves now, clusters, sometimes seconds apart, sometimes overlapping. Each one felt closer than the last, not in space, but in certainty. The sense that whatever distance once existed between her and the inevitable had collapsed entirely. She laughed suddenly, a short, hysterical sound. "You don't even need me to die," she said to the ceiling. "You just need me to notice." The knock answered instantly. She sobered. "That's it, isn't it?" she whispered. "Attention." The whisper softened, almost approving. Awareness. Mara closed her eyes. Images flooded her mind. Tom's face, her mother's voice, the missed call from Evan Calder. Each memory felt like a door she'd left ajar without realizing it. The knock accelerated. Faster, sharper, no pauses now. The countdown had dissolved into a blur of sound and sensation. Time compressed until only the next moment mattered. Mara sat up suddenly, clarity cutting through panic like a blade. "You need me conscious," she said. "You need me listening." The knock faltered, just slightly. She held her breath. "If I stop listening," she continued carefully, "you don't exist." The silence stretched, longer than it had in hours. Her heart hammered, but she stayed still, eyes closed, hands clenched in the blanket. For a moment she thought she'd found it, the last rule, the one that mattered. Then the whisper returned, closer than ever. "You're always listening." The knock exploded through the cabin, no longer a single sound, but a chorus, walls, floor, ceiling, inside her skull, so fast it felt like the world itself was being hammered apart. Mara screamed as the cabin shook around her. And somewhere in the chaos, something began to count down the last moments she had left. Not in minutes, not in seconds, but in heartbeats.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 9. Silence became more terrifying than the knocking. The knocking stopped all at once. Not gradually, not fading. Gone. Mara lay on the floor where the last wave of sound had driven her, hands clamped over her ears, mouth open in a scream that had burned itself out minutes ago. Her throat ached. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, painful gasps. The silence felt wrong. It pressed down on her like deep water, thick and absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to have paused, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Mara lowered her hands slowly. Nothing. No wind, no creaking beams, no ticking clock. The clock had stopped. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, heart hammering. The cabin looked unchanged, but it felt hollowed out, like a body after something vital had been removed. "Hello?" she whispered, hating herself the moment the word left her mouth. The silence did not answer. She scrambled to her feet, every nerve screaming. Her boots sounded too loud on the floor. Each step felt like a mistake, as though movement itself might restart something worse. She checked the walls. Nothing. The ceiling. Nothing. The door. Nothing. Her breathing slowed despite her fear, a traitorous sense of relief seeping in. The human mind reached for hope even when it had no right to. Maybe it was over. Maybe the thing had finished. She almost laughed. Then she remembered Tom. She moved toward the back room, dread pooling in her stomach. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching just enough to make her feel unsteady. The air grew colder with every step. Tom lay exactly where she'd left him, wrapped in the blanket, face hidden. The sight grounded her in a way nothing else could. Something had ended. Something final. Mara knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his wrist, even though she already knew. Cold. Still. Her breath hitched. That was when she understood. The knocking had always come after death. The silence meant. Her stomach dropped. Silence means it's your turn. The words echoed in her mind, fully formed, undeniable. Mara backed away from Tom's body, shaking her head. "No," she whispered, "you don't just stop." The cabin remained silent. No response, no whisper, no knock. Her heart began to race again, not with panic this time, but with realization. The countdown had not paused. It had completed. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Mara stood alone in the center of the cabin, turning slowly, waiting for something, anything to break the quiet. Her ears rang, straining for a sound that refused to come. The silence stretched longer than any knock ever had. Her thoughts grew loud in the absence of external noise. Memories surfaced uninvited. Regrets, half-forgotten moments she'd buried because they hurt too much to examine closely. She clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "Get out," she muttered. "You don't get to do this quietly." The cabin did not answer. She laughed weakly. "This is worse," she said to no one. "You know that, right?" Still nothing. Her heart slowed. That terrified her more than anything else. Fear was energy. Fear was resistance. Calm felt like surrender. She staggered toward the door, placing her hand on the wood. It was colder than before, the grain rough beneath her fingers. For the first time since the storm began, she considered opening it. The thought slipped in easily, seductively. If the knock was over, if the rule was complete, then maybe the door no longer mattered. Her hand tightened on the handle. A memory surfaced, her mother's voice, firm and gentle, telling her not to rush the end of things, to sit with discomfort, to let silence speak before filling it. Mara let go of the handle as if burned. "No," she whispered, "that's what you want." The silence deepened. It wasn't absence anymore. It was a tension. She felt it then, not a sound, not a presence, but a focus, narrow and absolute, fixed on her alone, the sense of being chosen. Her heart skipped. "Silence means it's your turn," she repeated aloud, her voice shaking. "But you don't get to decide when I listen." She sat down hard on the floor, back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. If the thing needed awareness, then she would give it nothing but stillness. Minutes crawled by. Her legs went numb. Her breathing slowed deliberately. The silence stretched thinner, tighter, like a wire pulled to its limit. Then, a sound. Not a knock. A breath. Right behind her ear. Mara froze, eyes wide.
The whisper finally returned, so soft it barely existed. Ready. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The knock followed immediately. One. Single. Perfect. From inside her chest. Mara screamed as the cabin seemed to fold inward around her, walls closing, darkness thickening. The silence shattered, and whatever came next was already closer than it had ever been.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. The door was never the point. Mara did not die. That was the first thing they wrote down. The rescue team reached the cabin 2 days after the storm broke. Plows cut through the road in grinding, patient passes. Radios crackled back to life. The mountain reluctantly gave her back. They found her sitting against the wall near the front door, alive, breathing, eyes open. She didn't respond when they called her name, didn't flinch when gloved hands touched her shoulders. Her pulse was steady. Her skin was warm. No signs of injury, no frostbite, no shock, according to the medic who kept checking and rechecking. "She's in there," he said finally, uncertain, just not all the way. They carried her out past the threshold she had never crossed. The door stood open behind them, creaking softly in the wind. It had never been locked. They cataloged the cabin afterward. Tom Weaver's body was found in the back room, wrapped carefully in a blanket. Cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, likely stress-induced. The mouse in the pantry was never mentioned in the report. No signs of forced entry, no footprints leading to the door, no damage to the walls. Just a cabin that felt wrong to everyone who stepped inside. One of the younger officers swore he heard a knocking while they worked. 3 taps, chest height. He didn't say anything out loud. Mara spent 3 days in the hospital. She spoke when spoken to, ate when prompted, slept without dreams. The doctors were relieved by that part. When asked what happened in the cabin, she answered carefully. "There was something that knocked," she said. They exchanged looks. Trauma response, hallucinations, grief. She didn't argue. On the 4th day, a nurse leaned in close while checking her vitals and whispered, "Did you hear anything strange out there?" Mara looked at her, really looked. The nurse's eyes flicked briefly toward the door, then back. Mara shook her head. No. The nurse exhaled, shoulders loosening, and smiled too widely. Good. As she left, her knuckles brushed the frame. 3 times. They released Mara on the 5th day. People from town brought casseroles and apologies and carefully neutral expressions. They spoke about survival like it was something you won by staying still long enough. But Mara knew better now. The door was never the point. She walked the mountain roads in the weeks that followed, retracing paths, listening. Cabins stood quiet, some abandoned, some occupied by people who avoided eye contact a little too carefully. She found them eventually. The others. Those who had heard the knock and never answered. They lived, but not the way they had before. Their routines were intact, their voices familiar, their smiles practiced, but something essential had been hollowed out and replaced with something efficient. They never knocked on doors. They waited. They paused before speaking, as if listening for permission. And sometimes, just sometimes, when Mara passed them on the road, they would look at her with something like recognition, or gratitude, or ownership. She stopped sleeping near doors.
She stopped responding when people knocked unexpectedly. She learned to sit in silence without filling it. Because silence wasn't empty. It was a test. The final report concluded there was no evidence of anything supernatural. The storm was blamed, the isolation, the human mind under pressure. Mara read it once, then burned it. She moved into a smaller place, one room, no hallway, no interior walls to echo. She left the radio off, covered the mirrors. At night, she sat with the quiet. Sometimes, rarely, she felt the urge to speak into it, to say hello, to acknowledge what waited just beyond awareness. She never did, because she understood the final truth now, the one the mountain had been trying to teach all along. The knock was never asking to come in. It was asking to be noticed, to be invited, to be agreed with. It didn't need doors. It didn't need bodies. It needed consent. Those who answered were gone. Those who didn't were left behind, changed, hollowed, reshaped into something quieter and more useful. Mara pressed her palm flat against the wall of her apartment, feeling the steady, unremarkable stillness beneath it. No knocking, not tonight. She whispered into the silence, not as a challenge, not as a greeting, but as a warning to anyone listening. "It doesn't take you," she said. The quiet held. She closed her eyes. "It replaces you."
The knock was never random. It followed death, because death leaves space behind, and something out there is always looking for an empty place to stand. They thought survival meant locking doors, but survival was always about restraint, about silence, about refusing to answer what already knows your name. Because the moment you acknowledge it, the moment you respond, you agree to be counted. So if you ever hear a knock that arrives too precisely, if it comes after tragedy, if it feels like it's waiting, not asking, remember this story. Remember the rule. And whatever you do, don't answer the knocking. If this story followed you into the silence, leave a comment. Subscribe for more full-length horror audiobooks. And tonight, listen carefully.